getting wrong, so not much surprise here. What I want to emphasize here is that maybe one of the main root of those problems is that there is a big gap between what cryptographers actually look at and what the code that actually runs on your machine. And so there are cryptographic errors, but there are also logical errors on top of it, and there are also just plain implementation errors. And all those details matter equally. Also, one discrepancy that there is between what is specified or documented as a protocol and what the code actually does, and that's another serious problem. So as a case study for that, we are focusing on TLS, which is a well-established practical protocol that is used in many places, and that has a long documented history of attack fixes and extensions. So here it's a very partial list of papers about TLS, but in essence the protocol has been evolving for 18 years, and we are not reaching a fixed point in the sense that for each major implementation there is still 2 or 3 emergency security patches issued every year. So in practice that's really not a solved issue. As I said, one problem is that people with different expertise look at different objects. So there are protocol standards, but they are written by implementers who are focusing on interop on the network and not really on security. In fact, if you look at the security claims in the RFCs, they are pretty vague, and at best they will point to a cryptographic paper, but that's the end of it. Then there are symbolic analysis, where we have had pretty good tools for a long while, but where we are really abstract about the cryptography. And then there are handwritten proofs with more precise models, but the first tools are really starting to emerge, and we didn't have a good automation for a long while. Also, not to forget, there are excellent tools that have been developed for verifying programs, and in a sense, we may be surprised that we need to do completely specific tools for studying programs that happens to deal a bit with cryptography. If you look at typical implementations, maybe the cryptographic part is 10% of the code, the rest has to do with networking and security and certificate management rather than core cryptography. And so taking advantage of tools that are for a more general purpose makes a lot of sense. A final problem is that those models are typically using pseudocode or core calculi like the PyCalculus, while implementations use low-level languages like C or C++, which makes the verification harder. And so, as you can guess, we are trying to bridge that gap by reasoning on the same objects that we can run as a concrete implementation written in a high-level language, and that we can automatically verify using precise computational models. So that's the purpose of that talk. So I want to explain how we proceed for verifying programs that rely on cryptography using computational assumptions. So I'm going to explain our techniques, which relies mostly on refinement types and parametricity. And as a main case study in application, I'm going to focus on TLS 1.2 to give you an idea of how we can verify this kind of implementation. So I will start by a demo showing that our code actually runs. And so it's a new reference implementation that supports a large subset of TLS, starting from SSL up to the latest extensions. And the reason for supporting old ones is that they are those that still matter in practice. So very few people use TLS 1.2. Most traffic is still using 1.0 at best. So what's the merit of that implementation? Well, it achieves two goals. It is standard compliant. So we try to stay as close as possible from the standard. So we adopt exactly its message formats. We support many of its features like multiple cipher suits, like sessions and connections, re-handshake, reassumptions. Also things like alerts and message fragmentations, which are quite important, if not directly cryptographic. And we'll see some interaction with the protocol later on. And we can test interop with existing servers. So here is our implementation. So you can see here the code for, where is it? For encrypting and decrypting with Magden Encrypt, with a special case for Mac-only cipher suit. So if I can find the window, where is it? Is it running? Here it is. So here is the window, and I can normally, and I can use a web browser to. So this is our a local copy of our servers, and I can go to read, for instance, a local copy of partial copy of my website, and normally. Okay. Yes, so the certificate is not registered, so we have to accept it. Continue, yes. Okay, so let's. Maybe it's the redirection that's affecting it. So of course it was working fine before, but. No, it's a local server, so normally the redirect will not matter. But the fact that my certificate is not registered does, clearly. Yeah, so. Yeah, okay, well, demos. It might be, I don't know. Okay, here it is. It was just timeout on something. Okay, so, and yes, I can navigate, go to papers. Okay, if you're not sure why the latency, usually it's reasonably fast. It's not the fastest web server, but it can handle large documents, so it's not really an issue. Okay, so after this brief demo, let me switch back to the talk. Okay, so so it's as you can see, it interrupts with existing web browsers. So more interestingly, perhaps it has verified security. So we managed to comply with the standards, but at the same time, the whole structure and the whole style of coding is really specific, so that we can get automated modular verification done to standard cryptographic assumptions. So we are in the probabilistic polytime model of crypto, and in essence what we obtain is computational security theorems that are as usual, except that the ideal functionalities that we have are something like 7,000 lines of ML code rather than pseudocode. So as a third goal, or as a side benefit, we get a nice experimental platform. And so each time there is a corner case in the standard, or we want to investigate some attacks, or to analyze new extensions, it's because the code is extremely modular, it's quite easy to code up some specific tests and to try some unusual behavior. And that was useful for identifying a few attacks that I will outline during the talk. So what do I mean by modular verification? So the key idea is to rely on the modular structure of ML programs, so each box representing a module, and to use a new type system that is precise enough so that we can characterize cryptographic assumptions like being in CMA or being in CPA just by writing a specific enough type interface. Then we can type check further cryptographic constructions or protocols or applications using protocols, relying on those interfaces, and then behind we can switch which implementation we choose, provided we trust or we prove that each of the boxes meets the assumptions documented by the type interface. So some type interfaces are going to represent standard cryptographic properties. Other standard interfaces, others are going to represent API. And also for some of them, we will craft them in such a way that they export just what we want to give to the adversary to model a class of attackers. So typically you will give our adversary full control over the network and also to the high-level API for controlling the application, and we still expect to prove security for those. So before going back to TLS, I want to explain how verification proceeds. And in particular, I want to illustrate our approach on some very simple ideal functionalities. Then we will see some of the main interfaces of TLS, which are much larger ideal functionalities, and I will only be able to show some outline of them. So as I said, we need a precise type system, and so to do that, we rely on refinement types. And so refinement type is just a usual type together with a formula that records what we know about that type. And so t may be an integer or something like that, and then we give a name to the value that has that type, and we can write a formula in first order logic describing our knowledge about that. And the type system is going to check that whenever we write a formula and attach it to a value, then to an expression, then the value of that expression will comply with the type. So we can do basic things, like we can define a type of natural numbers, non-negative numbers, by just saying that n is bigger than 0. We can also document that when we read some files from a socket, for example, then we get some bytes array whose length is smaller than the number of bytes that we requested. More cryptographically, we can still take bytes, which are just concrete byte arrays, and document more precisely what we know about those values. So for example, here we may have some bytes, but we want to use them as blocks, and so we may document that the length is 16 bytes. We can also document that the plain text that we use as a block is actually something that we intend to use as a plain text with this plain P predicate that will be defined by the application. And then we can record when we generate a ciphertext that this is a block that was produced by applying the AES algorithm on some key and some plain text. And so in practice, we move from documenting AES as a function from bytes to bytes to functions from plain to ciphers, which is still the same at runtime, but is much more precise for verification and will enable us to relate, for example, the authenticity of plain and ciphers depending on our assumptions on the encryption primitive. So from a typing viewpoint, we have usual things, but still extremely useful and essential for what we do. So we have type safety, meaning that whenever we give a type, then at runtime to an expression, then the expression reduces to a value that has that type. So it guarantees that all the formulas that we write are verified by type checking. And also, as is natural with type, but which essential for what we do, we get modular type checking, and so we can type check modules independently and then compose them against their interfaces, and the composition is also well typed, hence it will be secure. So concretely, we have a type checker that builds on top of F#, on top of .NET. So we program in F# rather than C, so it's still as expressive, but it's much easier to verify. And then we specify the properties of the code we write in extended type declarations fed to the F7 type checker, which is our tool. And the tool does the type checking, and because it has to verify that formulas follows from other formulas, it calls a Z-tree, which is an automated SMT solver whenever there is a proof obligation. And so once we have verified, we know that those interfaces are met by the implementations, and we can erase all those tab annotations. We get back a plain implementation that we can run, compile and run using F#. And we have been using this technique for a while, starting probably 4 years ago, 5 years ago, mostly with symbolic cryptography. And so we know we can verify large protocols, but only with symbolic, a much abstract model of cryptography. And so this work is really about using the same technique, but towards more standard PPT assumptions. So for verification, so we have, so each box is still a module, lines are interfaces, and so we can write a protocol, let's say for an authenticated RPC, in a few modules, and we can verify them against one another. For example, we can check that the RPC is correct, provided the formatting are correct, the formats for MAC messages are correct. And for some of those modules, type checking alone is not going to be enough. We need some cryptographic assumptions. And so we'll have a module, a concrete module, and then we'll have some security assumptions materialized as a type interface. And we'll use that ideal interface to verify the protocol code. Once each module is verified, we know that the composition is well typed, so we can run it with any program that accesses the interface, and that gives us security, both for applications running the code and also for adversaries trying to attack the code together with some application. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to show two sample functionalities. The first one is for authentication, and that's a basic MAC. I can skip that one. So what are MAC? So that's a simple but typical interface for MAC. So you can generate a key, and then you can use that key for macking and verifying messages, and that's what you will find in almost every programming language. It's not very informative, so it tells us that we get bytes, but it doesn't tell us anything about the security of MAC. So we need to make that interface finer. So the first step is to rely on type abstraction to protect the key and to guarantee that only the implementation of MAC will access the actual key value, and that the key will be treated just as a handle by the rest of the code. We can also document the size of things, and that's really important because, as you will see, in particular for TLS, we need to know exactly what is the length of the MAC in some part of the proof. But that's sort of a side benefit. We can also characterize what authenticity means for MAC by letting the protocol or the code that is going to use the MAC define a message predicate, and recording that message predicate as a precondition whenever we MAC, and as a post-condition whenever we verify, and the result of verify is true. And so these annotations typically says that however message is defined by the application, provided the application is well typed, then whenever a MAC is verified, it must have been MAC'd before, which is exactly what, informally, what we need to use the MAC, and in practice, that's sufficient to verify programs using the MAC quite naturally. And so, for example, we can show classic matching conversations or correspondence properties, relying on definition of that predicate in a protocol-specific manner. So we can also deal with key corruptions, but I'm not going to give too much details about that. But the main idea is that it's okay to leak keys provided you don't rely on them anymore for authentication, and that's also something we can capture by typing. Okay, so we have this nice ideal interface which is usable, but which is a bit unrealistic. So if we implement it using a concrete MAC algorithm, for example, like HashMAC SHA-1, then we know that this interface is impossible to implement in a well-typed manner, unless there is some shared state between the shared table between the application that you, the colors of MACs and the colors of verify. So, so we know it's, we cannot meet that interface, so we know in particular that any concrete implementation that we provide, we are not going to be able to type check with that property. And so, as you can guess, we need to apply a cryptographic assumptions to, because if we just call MACs and we don't say anything about that, then we don't know how secure it is. So to do that, we recast in F# a game, the CMA game, by, as usual, generating a key and giving Oracle access to the adversary, to a function for macking and for verifying, and declaring with this assert that the adversary wins if it can get a message to verify that was not macked before. And with that code, which is also written in F#, we can express asymptotic security by bounding the probability that any polytime program calling mack and verify but not giving access to the key will be able to falsify the assert in the code. So that's what you are going to use as an assumption. So we still have our RPC, and we know that we can verify the RPC protocol knowing against the ideal MAC interface. And you have a concrete MAC implementation. That seems okay, but that is certainly not typeable because it's only computationally secure, we hope. So the main step here is to introduce, to program actually, ideal MAC in between that is going to implement the ideal MAC interface using a concrete MAC, essentially by correcting any errors. So the ideal MAC just logs all the requests, and if it notices that the concrete MAC says returns true to a MAC that was not, for a plain text that was not MAC'd before, then it changes that response to false. And so because it does that, this is always correct. And in fact, we can verify by typing that now this code implements the ideal MAC. And so what remains to show is that this ideal MAC does not correct errors too often. And that's where we are going to use the cryptographic assumption. So the proof goes in 2 steps. So we can verify by typing and show that the concrete MAC running with the ideal MAC and the RPC on any adversary is perfectly safe. Then we can show that we can remove the ideal MAC without changing the behavior of the whole system, except with a negligible probability, thanks to the CMA assumptions. And so by composition, we know that the concrete system is safe with overwhelming probability. And so we have a theorem that says, in particular, that we can add or remove the ideal functionality for MAC without changing, while remaining indistinguishable under some typing assumptions. Okay, so that was for MAC and the CMA. So let me now tell you, tell you a bit about how we do indistinguishability and for encryptions. And so the indistinguishability is different because from MAC, what we verify are essentially trace properties, while with encryption, what we are after is equivalence properties. So we need new tools from typing, and the idea is a classic one from typing. It's just parametricity, which says that if you can type a program with an abstract type, a type variable for some of its values and expressions, then it's impossible for that program to extract any information about the representation of that value except calling the interface that is given to that. And so here we have a special class of interfaces that we are going to define plain text or anything you want to keep secret. And we have a theorem that says that provided that interface does not leak any information about abstract types, and so in particular you can turn concrete values into abstract values but not the converse, then you cannot tell the difference between any two variants, any two implementations of that parametric interface. So here A can be seen as an adversary. It has to return a Boolean like in the indistinguishability game. It is given access to P alpha 0 or P alpha 1, but because the type interface does not let any information flow from values of type alpha back to A, the Boolean answer cannot depend on that. And so we get perfect secrecy or perfect indistinguishability by typing in that setting. So I should say that at this point we have formally verified using COC the type theory, so including type safety and secrecy by typing, but not the cryptographic part, which relies on proofs and papers. Okay, so we have a notion of parametricity that we think we can use for proving secrecy or indistinguishability properties. So now we still have to define our ideal functionality for things like CPA or CCA2 encryption. And so what we do is to parameterize any encryption modules by another module that defines what the plain text are using an abstract type. And so we have an abstract type, and we also have a representation which says they are just bytes, and we have to constrain the length of the plain text, because otherwise we know we won't be able to implement it. And then we have functions that can take a representation and turn it into an abstract plain value, or take an abstract plain value and turn it into a representation. And we need them to run with the concrete encryption implementation, because in that case, we actually need to access the representation so that we can encrypt, and we will need to go from the representation to plain after decryption, for example. However, if we rely on some ideal encryption that, say, encrypts zeros instead of the plain text, then in fact, that implementation need not access the functions plain and rep anymore, and we can verify that by typing, of course. And so, if we implement that interface and provide the ideal implementation for it that encrypts zeros, then we can show, again by typing, that that ideal implementation is parametric in plain. So it uses plain, but it never calls the coercion function that enables to turn plain values into bytes, and vice versa. And so we can give it that interface. And now what happens in terms of secrecy depends on the application. So if the application decides to leak information about the plain text, then that's okay. What the ideal implementation theorem says is that the encryption itself is not leaking any information about plain text values. And so if in addition you can prove that the application does not leak information about plain text, then you can prove that the composition of the application plus the protocol implements indistinguishability for your secret. And so we have a theorem. And so we have a theorem again that says that provided your encryption is, for example, CCA2 and meets some typing assumption, then you can add or remove the ideal encryption layer that substitute zeros for plain text, and without changing what can be observed except with a negligible probability. So, as you know, there are many different notions of security for encryption, and so depending on what we get or what we expect from our cryptographic assumptions, we can get weaker or stronger assumptions. So, for example, if we do CPA instead of CCA, then that's not very hard. We just have to provide the post conditions for encryption and to require that decryption is called only on messages that have been encrypted before. And that's, for this interface, one can show that CPA is sufficient to idealize this and tap check this with a switch between the ideal implementation and the concrete one that is negligible, or that is the same concretely as the probability of breaking the CPA again. Sorry. We can also do authenticated encryption, and here we get something stronger. So we get, for example, that if you have a message predicate, much like for MAC, then decryption may succeed or fail, but if it succeeds, it returns an authentic value, as documented by this refinement, this message refinement. Okay, so that ends my overview of the verification method we are going to use. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to show how we can apply that for verifying TLS rather than authenticated RPCs or base functionalities. But the main ideas are the same. So in particular for guaranteeing strong secrecy, we are still going to use this kind of encryption modules parameterized by a plain module and rely on parametricity to get secrecy for the payload. So yeah, I guess you have all seen TLS, but let me remind a few details about the protocol. So as you may be aware, TLS is in fact a collection of protocols that are interconnected. So it is structured in 2 layers. So there is so it works on top of TCP, and then there is a record layer, and then there are 4 protocols, each with a content type. So the record layer sends and receives fragments with some content type, and depending on the content type, the packet is multiplexed to the handshake, to the chance cipher suite, to the alert, or to the application data protocol. So something that's quite important and usually, to my knowledge, never looked at in cryptographic analysis is that in fact it's not the case that the handshake protocol runs and then the application data protocol runs. In effect, the 4 protocols are always running together in parallel, and it's possible to send application data while negotiating the next round of keys. And so the application controls the handshake protocol and sometimes is notified about alert but the handshake protocol is always running in effect, and from time to time it's going to push keys from the protocol layer down to the record layer as the new keys to use for authenticated encryption. Also, something to keep in mind is that the record layer is asynchronous, and so the two directions are decoupled. And so in particular, it's quite possible to be using one set of keys and one ciphersuit for one direction and some other set of keys and parameters for the other direction. And eventually, things will stabilize, but in between, there are strong cases where we are in between two different sets of keys. So for negotiating the keys, there is the handshake protocol, and so it's a flexible protocol that depends on ciphersuits. So there is a full version of it that you run if you don't know the guy at the other end. But if you remember a key that you had with the guy at the other end, then you can try an abbreviated handshake, which is much faster by reusing a premaster secret from the past and providing a fresh pair of nonces to derive fresh keys for the new connection. Another thing that is still quite confusing me is the interplay between sessions and connections. And so the two are quite distinct, and there is certainly not a one-to-one mapping between the two in TLS. So sessions roughly are about key establishment and managed by the handshakes, while connections corresponds to the use of keys generated by the handshakes. And so this is a handshake notion, this is roughly a transport layer notion. And in particular, it's quite possible to have a single TLS connection that runs through through a series of epochs with different principles, ciphersuits and keys. So you can start TLS with some set of certificates, then change your mind later, and authenticate the other guys or provide extra certificates, or even change the cryptographic algorithm you are using as part of the renegotiation. And so, and it's a source of confusion because some people interpreted the fact that you can redo a handshake as rekeying, while in fact you can change many other parameters, including the identities of the principals at the other end. And so you have this interleaving. So you start with an unprotected TCP connection, then you negotiate the first handshake unprotected, and then you have the finished message that is already using the keys generated by the handshakes, and you have some data. And while exchanging data, at the same time, we are discussing the next handshake. And then we switch, and again, maybe at the end we will close, and then maybe in parallel to be faster, we are going to use another TCP connections and reuse a session that was established in the first connection, and then rekey, and then get an alert message later on. So these details matter, and so in particular there are interesting attacks, recent attacks mixing fragmentation and re-handshakes, whereby it was shown to be possible, practically possible, actually quite easy, to feed the first connection with some application data that is buffered because the handshake is not, and then to redirect an initial handshake for a target client towards a re-handshake for the server you have been talking to, and to get that server confused so that it accepts the data that was sent in the first handshake as valid data for the second handshake. And it was there are concrete attacks where you can steal cookies using these kind of things. And so the problem here is that, in fact, if you look at the API, there is no way to tell the application that the guy at the other end has changed. So there is a renegotiation, there is a new key, maybe a new certificate, but the interface does not even provide a way to notify the application that the identity at the other end has changed. And so formally the best you can prove if you don't change the API is that you received a message and that you know that the first half was sent by A and that the first part was sent by A and the second part was sent by B, but you cannot even tell which part is from A and which part is from B. So to fix that problem, we had to refine our API and to, in effect, make sure that our API never caches application data so that we can always be extremely precise about when warnings or ciphertext or ciphersuit changes occur. So the The more standard fix so that you don't have to change APIs is to introduce self-negotiations, where instead of authenticating the series of messages for the current handshake, you recursively hash the whole history of handshake that you have been doing on the connection from the beginning. So there is a similar new attack that we found as part of developing this code that has to do with alert messages. So alert messages is, so the alert protocol is extremely simple. It relies on 2-byte long messages to notify either warnings or fatal errors. And because warning and fatal errors are used, maybe used at any point in the protocol, in fact, it's okay to send alerts before the first handshake. And so you can take a message and inject a constant message early in the handshake. And because the message belongs to the alert protocol, it's not hashed together in the finished message, so it's invisible from the handshake viewpoint. And so if you send a partial handshake, which has to be 1 byte, then this byte is going to be cached by the alert protocol. And later on, possibly a few handshakes later, when the application sends authenticated alert or a warning, then this fragment is sent to the alert protocol, which concatenates it with A, and takes the first 2 bytes as the valid alert to be dispatched to the application. And so with this extremely simple attack, the AB alert is sent as an authenticated warning or alert to the application instead of the BC that was intended. And so the fix is quite obvious. Once you have noticed that, there is no reason to accept fragmented alerts because fragmentation is meant to be used for much larger messages. But nonetheless, we could try that and get OpenSSL to accept unauthenticated warnings. What else about TLS? So, well, there are cipher suits, and cipher suits there are many of them. And not all algorithms into cipher suits are equal. So some cipher suits just say that there is no cryptographic protection at all. Some others say that we are just doing authenticated encryption. Some of them use pretty old algorithms like MD5 or RC4, which is not great. Some others actually say that the client is anonymous, while others insist on the client being authenticated. So it's really hard to say anything good about the security of TLS unless you restrict which cipher suits are going to be used. A very interesting recent paper shows as a cautionary tale that even the latest, allegedly strongest cipher suits may actually be open to attacks due to implementation errors. So what they did is to find in OpenSSL a software bug attack on the multiplication algorithm that enables them to break the security of TLS ECDH cipher suits in roughly a few hundred handshakes. And so, well, bugs happen, but what's interesting is that this bug was actually deployed in major releases of the system and was left open for something between 1 and 2 years without anyone noticing. And so we just it's not just about saying you should not use MD5. There are just many cipher suits, and you have to control which one are used because you are going to get varying security depending on what you chose. And so intuitively, of course, the whole purpose of negotiation is that clients and servers should get the security that they accept. And so if I'm aware of that, or I don't want to use MD5, then I should be okay. But proving that it works, although you are running an implementation that supports all the cipher suite and that also supports earlier versions of TLS, is really challenging. And so because there are 50, 60 cipher suite these days, we really want to have a verification that is generic and that is parameterized by the cryptographic algorithms that are going to be used rather than specific to one particular cipher suite. Okay, so in the rest of the talk, I'm just going to focus on 3 chosen interfaces. So first, we are going to look at a low-level interface for authenticated encryption, which is really the core of the record layer. Then we are going to look at the interface between the handshake protocol and the record layer, which was already discussed by Bogdan earlier during the workshop, where we end up with a new ideal interface that bypasses the problem with a finished message. And finally, I'm going to outline the top-level interface, which you can see both as the specification of ideal functionality and as a concrete API that you can use for writing code that relies on TLS. So it's authenticated encryption, but well, there are a few more details. So you need to be parameterized by the choice of cryptographic algorithms. You need to deal with messages of different lengths, and you need to hide some information about their lengths. Then some of the ciphertools require that the algorithm be stateful. And also, because we want to authenticate the version number for the protocol, the sequence numbers, and the like, we have to provide authenticated encryption with additional data. So we arrive at an interface that is quite similar to the one I have shown for authenticated encryption earlier in the talk, except that there are maybe 4 or 5 extra parameters to support all those features, and so that we can program authenticated encryption that works for most of the underlying algorithms in the ciphertools that we want to implement. So how does authenticated encryption works in TLS? Well, there are different modes, but the most common is to use MAC, then encrypt, or if you look at the details, you fragment, then you MAC, then you encode with some padding, then you encrypt. And those intermediate details actually matter. So we want to send some plaintext message. We have sent some values earlier. We chunk first a fragment out of the message, and we keep the rest for later. Then this fragment is MAC'd, is padded, is encrypted. And then a header is added, and the thing is sent on the TCP connection. And some important details like how and when you should fragment and pad are under-specified. So fragmentation, it just depends. So typical implementation tries to send the largest fragment possible. But we tried, and you can actually fragment the hello message in 60 fragments, and implementation still support that. The padding is also under-specified, and so you can do minimal padding, but you can also add additional padding in order to hide the length of your messages. And of course, the length of the MAC and the block and the fact that you can even add some padding depends on the ciphertools. So if you are using RC4, for example, there is no need for padding, and so you cannot hide anything about the length of your messages. But if you use AES-CBC, then it's quite possible, and some implementations support that. As you must know, there were many recent issues with implementations of this MAC and encrypt, and so there are quite a few papers about padding oracles and error oracles for TLS, which exploit the fact that TLS has to decrypt before authentication. And so if you can meddle with the encrypted record, then a strange thing can happen before the MAC can be verified, and that can be exploited in clever ways. So for that, we did the proof by hand. It's code-based, so it's based on the program you have written, but the proof itself is by hand for AES CBC with assuming a strong MAC. And the proof is actually ad hoc. There are no generic reductions, and so in the proof there is a special case where you actually have to show that it must be the case that the MAC is always bigger than the size of individual blocks, otherwise some attacks occurs. And so we found that attack just trying to show that our code was correct, and independently that attack was recently reported at AsiaCrypt by Ristenpart et al. And it's a nice surprising attack that really depends on the constant size of blocks versus size of MACs. And fortunately in TLS, MACs are always bigger than blocks, but in some proposed extensions, you can use so-called truncated MACs. And so if you use 80-bit MACs, then you are in trouble. Some other feature that is usually completely ignored is that, in fact, TLS does compression for you, and it does it automatically. If you are using, for example, Google Chrome with Apache, I think that compression is negotiated by default, and that's very bad for traffic analysis. So the big problem here is that compression occurred after fragmenting. Normally you would compress then fragment, but here you fragment then compress. And so if you fragment at the maximal length, which is 16K, then you compress. Then by observing the sequence of compressed, encrypted, fragment, you get a rather precise message fingerprint that leaks much more information than the total length of the message. And so we experimented with that, and so those are different MP3s, and you can see that the length, the deviation from the maximal length after encryption is quite unique for every song we will be trying to download over HTTPS. And so it suffices to have 5 or 6 successive sizes to uniquely identify each of the songs we experimentally try to download over that channel. So in practice, if you know what the songs are and you want to know if people are downloading them, then you just have to observe a few packets and you can tell with high precision that this file and not others are being downloaded. Okay, so how do we deal with that? So we want to provide some length hiding features because that's important, and some people rely on that. And so the solution we end up with is to separate the range of the size of the plaintext with the actual length of the plaintext. And so the range is public and is chosen by the application, but the actual length within that range is secret. And so now our implementation is such that all the decisions about how to fragment and how to pad and how to cut things into blocks depend only on the public range, but never on the actual size of the value. And so you can, for example, as an application, choose the size of your bucket. You can say, I want to encrypt a URL which is between 0 and 200 bytes and hide its length, or I want to encrypt a 3 megabyte image plus or less 10%. And by just writing the integer length range that you would expect. So this is the shape of the plaintext. So inside there is some actual payload. And we fragment and encode depending on that range. And then we call into the abstract module that implements the plain fragment to do the actual splitting. And so that each of the fragments is going to be partially filled and then padded following the encoding of TLS. And so as a result, after encryption, you can tell what is the range, but there is no information leakage about the actual size of the message you are sending. Okay, so we arrive at this implementation for authenticated encryption. So recall that encryption is parameterized by a plaintext module, so that we can make abstract the type of the plaintext for that. And so it's similar to what we had before, but now we have quite a few parameters. So we have, so fragments are parameterized by some key info, which in essence contains a unique key identifier plus a description of all the algorithms that are used. Then there is a range. Then there is some additional data. And so you can think of this abstract type as, you can think of that as a distinct abstract type for each key info, additional data, and range, so that since each of them has a distinct abstract type, they cannot be mixed or they cannot be forged by the application just by, as long as we can ensure parametricity. So, of course, in some cases, we are not going to be parametric, and so we have to provide some leak and coerce function that turns fragment into bytes and bytes into fragment. But they are prefixed by a precondition on the key info that says that in order to be able to switch, in order for TLS to be able to switch between abstract fragments and concrete bytes, it must be the case that the key index is not safe. And so now, if we use a broken cipher suit, for example, the key info is not going to be safe, and so our implementation concrete will be able to extract the bytes and encrypt them. Now, if we use a cipher suit or a key that has been properly generated with a good guy at the other end, then we are going to be safe, and the implementation is not going to access the actual bytes of our secret. Of course, the implementation doesn't know whether the key index is safe or not, but this is there so that we can specify that as long as the key index is safe, then we get strong secrecy for the payload. Now we have defined plaintext, we can define encryption. So you can see that it's similar to what we had before, but it has the 3 indexes as before. So the key info, the key, which is the actual key value, and the additional data. Then for encrypting, it takes a range and a fragment for that key info, that range, and that additional data, so that you cannot if you mix fragments or you send a fragment out of schedule, you will immediately get a type error because the indexes will not match. And then we get a cipher. We have some conditions. So we know that the length of the cipher is of logical functions of the key information together with the range that we provided and nothing else, which is the key point here. And we also have an abstract predicate, ctxt, that records that C is a correctly generated ciphertext for this plain text with that additional data and that ki, and that's the basis for characterizing int ctxt as a property of authenticated encryption. So for decryption, we have something similar. So we take a ciphertext with a length that has to be compatible with the key information. And what we get back is a range and a fragment option, because decryption may fail. But we know that the range has to be something that depends only on the ciphertext, in effect, in practice, only on the length of the ciphertext. And moreover, we know that provided the key index is safe, the only thing we can get is a correctly encrypted message and nothing else. And so this guarantees, if you look at it carefully, this guarantees that decryption cannot implement any side channels through an error message or a padding due to a padding error alert, an error in the padding checks, for instance. So what else to say? So in the analysis, we made some simplifying assumptions, which gives us a simpler proof and a better bound. So we assume and we rely on the fact that TLS only uses at most once each additional data for every key info and key that are generated, for any key info, in fact. And also that decryption returns a fatal error when there is a decryption error. And so the fact that we never try to decrypt again after getting an error is quite important to prevent leakage of information through the abnormal termination of the connection. Okay, so I still have a few minutes to tell you a bit about the handshake and then the top-level interface. So the handshake is complicated. So that's the outline of the interface that we have. So there are, I just want to point out three important points. So the main point, so here you see that there are, so you can initiate a sequence, you can resume, re-handshake as before, and each time you have a token that represents the live connection state for the current handshake. And then you can, so the transport layer can use a next fragment to, let me think, a next fragment to ask the handshake protocol whether it wants to do something. And then it gets one of those answers like, I have a fragment to send, I want to send a CCS, or I want to notify you that the handshake is complete. And it also provides a handler for messages that are received by the transport layer. So when a message is received, like a fragment or a CCS fragment, then one of those functions is going to be called so that the handshake then can react by saying, now I think I have a complete handshake, or now I know what the TLS version is that you are going to negotiate. And so we can see here that the handshake acts as a black box because the type of the state is abstract that communicates on the using a fragment, essentially using the transport layer as an untrusted transport. And from time to time, it notifies the user, meaning TLS, that either some keys are available or the handshake is complete. But what is essential here is that we don't do the same at the same time, because we can't, because in order to complete the handshake, we need to use the key to verify the finished message. And so the main idea here is that we return the key, but we don't say anything good about them. Then later, we notify the user of the key that in fact those keys have stronger properties. And so that by typing, it's okay to encrypt the finished message because the finished message is unauthenticated and is not secret. But if you want to send some application payload that is abstract, then you will need to wait for the handshake to be complete because before you can start sending some application data content type on the network. So here they are omitted, but the refinement implies precise matching conversations roughly to the level of what we had in the symbolic model for TLS. And at any point, the TLS can read the parameters that are being negotiated by the handshake. So we have ideal handshake, and the handshake, the ideal handshake very often makes two assumptions. So I make two changes to the concrete one. It keeps track of whether indexes or key indexes are safe. And when a key index is safe, it uses a global table with abstractly generated keys for the underlying algorithms for the authenticated encryption. Otherwise, it just uses the concrete key derivation function. And also, for safe indexes, it drops complete notifications that are not preceded by an actual finish message at the other end. So the ideal version generates fresh keys instead of derived ones, and guarantees that completion is preceded by sending the final finish message at the other end. Okay, so the main API is, in a sense, it's quite similar to what you will find with OpenSSL, for example. So it's event-driven. In particular, we use the color thread, and so we do support running any number of connections and sessions at the same time, but all the scheduling is left to the application so that we don't get into trouble in the computational model for it. We also give more control to the application code than what is usually convenient for programming. In particular, we reflect precisely when we get warnings, when there is a handshake, when there is a change of situation in the underlying protocol, and that's necessary so that we can document at that API the precise security properties we want to verify for TLS. But otherwise, it's quite standard, and it's quite easy to implement a more standard or more abstract API on top of it for convenience. And so we have written a few applications that we can prove secure on top of that ideal, on top of this ideal API. So that's roughly the shape, but it doesn't matter much, I suppose. What to say there? And maybe just one remark is that we represent partial writes by just returning the rest of the message. So if we try to write a large message, we cannot write everything because of fragmentation. Then we send back what we couldn't send, so that we never buffer data. And non-buffering data is very important, because if you buffer data and there is a new handshake, then you don't know what to do with the data anymore, and it's very hard to remain precise. So we also had a look at some recent extensions, including those like snapstart and false start, which typically trade security for speed in the handshake. So you can greatly improve the protocol by making more assumptions about shared information between the client and the server. And finally, we are currently working and consolidating the tools that we have. And so for now, the theory of our tools is formalized, but not the implementation. Also, for similar tools, we didn't manage to have full certification using COG. Also, for now, the cryptographic arguments behind the type interfaces are local, but they are done by hand on the code that we have, and we would like to have machine checks proofs for them, as in CertiCrypt or maybe EasyCrypt. Also, by necessity, we trust the F# compiler on the .NET runtime, but it's just an even task on making sure they are reasonable. I have to say a few words on side channels. So we model some of them, but really not all of them. In particular, we say nothing about timing analysis and or differential power analysis or this kind of thing, which are just outside the scope of the language we are modeling here. What we do is just to implement the countermeasures of the RFC as well as we can. And we can probably argue that by being parametric, there is much less opportunities for leaking information about secrets, but that's quite a qualitative argument. Also, as we have noticed, we use ML, and we rather like ML, so we could, in principle, use another implementation language, but at some high cost. And also, it's not because we will be able to use C that you will be able to verify legacy code, which is really the big difficulty with concrete implementation. So there is a C code that has not been written with verification in mind, and which is really hard to verify, even if it is correct. Some conclusions. So so as I've argued, it's quite important to capture the implementation details of protocols, not just the core cryptographic constructions. And so in the process of this work, we have rediscovered many classic attacks, and we found a few new minor ones. So the key, the specificity of this implementation is to enable both reasonably efficient implementations and formal claims about its security. However, we would like to move more towards certification, and also there are many new extensions and changes that have been proposed to TLS, so there is still quite a lot of work to understand them better. For more generally the verification method, so I have shown that we can verify large implementation of protocols by type checking, and with a few essential features. So verification has to be modular, which is necessary for this kind of composed protocols. It relies on types with both refinement types and abstract types for verification. It relies on standard assumptions in the computational model for the base cryptographic primitives. And we get precise composition, conditional composition by using precise type interfaces. And whenever there is new cryptography, we have to do more proofs and design new interfaces. But otherwise, for protocol verification itself, things are much easier and faster. Well, we could use other languages, but so far we really like F# and F7. Thanks.
Do you have questions? So do you reckon you could do this for other? So you have very general tools, yeah?
Yes, sir.
And you've focused them on TLS.
Yes, sir.
So what? Of course, if you have general tools, you actually want to use them on other protocols.
Indeed, yes.
So what's your next goal?
Okay, our immediate goal is to get more coverage for TLS. So we want to cover more cipher suits that we do, and you want to study the extensions. Otherwise, we think that the approach would apply to other existing protocols. TLS is pretty tough as verification goes. So, but we chose TLS because it has a very well documented history of verification, and this hasn't been done before, but we know a lot about TLS already. So we think as a benchmark, it's a good case study. This takes time, so developing a complete standard compliant implementation of TLS is a lot of work. Only part of it being cryptographic. So I would encourage everyone to use this kind of tools, but I'm not sure how many more complex protocols we can do on our own. So we applied the same method to verify some new security API developed at Microsoft, the DKM DLL that is used for distributing keys in Microsoft data centers. We are also using the same technique to verify zero knowledge proof compilers that you are working on. And I think that's the three main case studies that we have at this point. But yes, that would apply to every protocol, even a simpler one than TLS. And so. Okay, thanks.